In our previous episode, we witnessed the rise of a Roman nobleman who cast a long shadow over the life of young Judah Ben-Hur. Betrayed by one he once called a brother, Judah was torn from his family, bound in chains, and cast into a fate darker than death itself. Now, as the tides of time begin to shift, the story continues, across distant seas and sacred cities. In this second book of Ben-Hur, a tale of the Christ, the journey deepens. Old wounds seek healing, faith is tested, and destiny begins to unfold in ways neither man nor empire can control. Let us now return to that ancient world, where every heartbeat echoed with purpose, and every step led closer to truth. The story must now leap ahead 21 years, to a turbulent time marked by unrest in Jerusalem. It was the beginning of Valerius Gratus's rule, the fourth Roman governor of Judea. Many would come to see this period as the very start of the final conflict between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. Much had changed since then, especially in Judea's political landscape. Herod the Great had died within a year of the Christ child's birth. His end was so tragic, many in the Christian world believe it to be divine punishment. Like many rulers obsessed with power, Herod had hoped to establish a lasting dynasty. In his will, he split his kingdom among his three sons, Antipas, Philip, and Archelaus, naming the last as his successor. But such matters required approval from the emperor. Augustus accepted the will, with one exception. He denied Archelaus the title of king, offering him the lesser title of ethnarch instead. For 9 uneasy years, Archelaus ruled, but his failures and his inability to control rising tensions led to his exile in Gaul. The emperor's response didn't stop there. He struck a painful blow to the pride of Jerusalem's people. Judea was stripped of even nominal sovereignty and made a Roman province, absorbed into the larger Syrian prefecture. The proud city, once ruled by a king from the palace on Mount Zion, now answered to a second-tier Roman official, the procurator, who reported through the Syrian legate in Antioch. Even more humiliating, the procurator wasn't allowed to govern from Jerusalem. Instead, he resided in Caesarea. To further their shame, Samaria, long despised by the Jews, was merged into the same province. For the deeply religious Pharisees, standing shoulder to shoulder with the followers of Mount Gerizim was unbearable. In this season of grief, only one small comfort remained. The high priest still lived in Herod's palace in the market district, keeping up the appearance of Jewish rule. Yet in truth, power belonged to Rome. The procurator held the authority over life and death. Justice was Roman. Taxes were Roman. And sharing the palace were Roman officials, tax collectors, registrars, informers, and spies. Still, for those who dreamed of freedom, the sight of a Jewish high priest in that palace kept hope alive. It reminded them of ancient promises, of the time when Jehovah ruled through the sons of Aaron. And so they endured, believing the son of Judah would come to lead Israel once again. For over 80 years, Judea had been under Roman control, long enough for the Caesars to study their subjects. And they learned one thing clearly. If the Jews' religion was respected, they could be ruled in peace. Following that logic, the governors before Gratus avoided tampering with Jewish traditions. But Gratus broke from that approach. One of his first actions was removing Hannas from the high priesthood and replacing him with Ishmael, son of Phabus. Whether this decision came from Augustus or Gratus himself remains unclear, but its consequences were quickly felt. Without delving deep into Judean politics, a brief explanation is needed. At that time, there were two major political groups, the nobles and the popular separatists. When Herod died, these groups united to oppose Archelaus. Their struggle spanned from the temple to the imperial court in Rome, by intrigue and by sword. The halls of Moriah echoed with conflict. In time, They succeeded in sending Archelaus into exile, but they were never truly united. The nobles despised Djoser, the high priest, while the separatists fiercely supported him. When Archelaus fell, Djoser fell with him. The nobles then appointed Hannes, son of Seth. That split the alliance, igniting fierce opposition. During their earlier fight with Archelaus, the nobles had aligned with Rome. They pushed for Judea to become a province, knowing that some form of governance would have to follow. That betrayal gave the separatists more reason to attack. When Samaria was added to the province, the nobles became a weakened minority, holding on to influence only through Roman favor and their own prestige. Still, for 15 years, until Gratus arrived, they managed to retain control of both palace and temple. Hannes, revered by his party, had served Rome well. Roman soldiers held the Tower of Antonia. Roman guards secured the palace gates. Roman judges enforced Roman law. Roman taxes burdened both city and countryside. In every moment and through every avenue, the people were reminded of their chains. Yet Hannes maintained order. No one was more loyal to Rome. So, when he was dismissed, the change was immediately felt. Passing his sacred garments to Ishmael, Hannes left the temple courts and joined the ranks of the separatists, leading a new faction of Bethusians and Scythians. Now, without a reliable ally, Gratus watched old tensions reignite. Just a month after Ishmael assumed office, Gratus visited Jerusalem. As he passed through the city gates, the people jeered and hissed. But when they saw a full Roman cohort march into the Tower of Antonia, they understood his intent. Rome was tightening its grip. If Gratus sought to make an example of anyone, the fate of the first rebel would be grim indeed. With the political tensions still lingering in the background, attention is drawn now to one of the palace gardens on Mount Zion. The scene unfolds beneath the relentless midday sun of July, when the summer heat presses down hardest. Surrounded on all sides by grand buildings, some rising 2 stories high, the garden offers both splendor and shelter. Verandas shade the lower windows and doors, while upper galleries, bordered by strong balustrades, add both protection and elegance. Here and there, the architecture opens into low colonnades, allowing the rare breezes to pass through and offering glimpses into other corners of the estate, hinting at the palace's vastness and grandeur. The garden itself is thoughtfully arranged. Winding pathways and patches of grass are scattered among clusters of shrubs. A few tall trees, rare palms mixed with carob, apricot, and walnut, lend beauty and occasional shade. At the heart of it all lies a large marble reservoir. Cleverly designed gates allow water to flow from it into narrow channels that run alongside the paths, rescuing the garden from the dryness common to the region. Not far from this reservoir, a small pool nourishes a thick clump of cane and oleander, plants typically found by the Jordan or near the salty shores of the Dead Sea. Between the flowering cluster and the reflective pool, 2 boys sat in deep conversation. The sun poured down upon them, but they seemed untouched by the heat or the breathless air. One was around 19, the other perhaps 17. At a glance, they could have passed for brothers. Both had dark hair and black eyes, and their deeply bronzed skin added to their likeness. Yet a closer look revealed distinct differences. The older boy sat bareheaded, clothed in a loose, gray wool tunic that dropped to his knees. It was trimmed with red at the sleeves and hem and bound at the waist with a tasseled silk cord. A light blue mantle lay beneath him as a cushion. His arms and legs, like his face, were bronzed by the sun. But there was a certain refinement in his posture, a grace in his features, and a cultured tone to his voice that clearly marked him as Roman. Everything about him, his clothes, his manner, his gaze, reflected a noble upbringing. He belonged to the house of Messala, a family with deep ties to Rome's highest ranks. His ancestors had once stood with Brutus and later reconciled with Augustus, earning honor and favor. When Judea was made a province, Augustus had appointed the boy's father to oversee the collection of taxes there. Since then, he had lived in Jerusalem, sharing the palace with the high priest. The young man before the fountain was his son, raised to remember his family's legacy and his grandfather's allegiance to Roman greatness. His companion, more slender in frame, wore flowing white linen, an attire common in Jerusalem. A yellow-corded cloth covered his head, draping down his back. While his clothing was distinctly Judean, his features told the fuller story. Unlike the Romans' narrow, high forehead and sharp, aquiline nose, this youth's face bore the hallmarks of his Jewish heritage. A broad, low forehead, long nose with wide nostrils, full cheeks with a wine-like flush, and lips softly curved like Cupid's bow, all combined to create a face that radiated strength, softness, and beauty. While the Romans' appearance was austere and noble, the Jews' was lush and radiant. During their conversation, the younger boy had brought up the topic of the new procurator's arrival, a topic clearly occupying many minds at the time. Greek, curiously enough, had become the language of polite society across Judea. From palace to military camp, from classrooms to even the sacred temple itself, the language had taken root, so much so that it flowed even in places once closed to Gentile tongues. The older youth confirmed the expected arrival, explaining that the information came from the newly appointed high priest, Ishmael, who had spoken to his father the previous evening. While he admitted that news from an Egyptian, or worse, an Idumean, would usually be taken with doubt, he had further verified the report that morning. A centurion from the tower had confirmed that the palace was preparing for the newcomer. Armorers were polishing helmets and shields. The Roman eagles and globes were being regilded, and rooms long unused were now being aired and readied, likely for the governor's bodyguard. Everything pointed to the arrival of someone important, and Jerusalem was preparing to receive him. The full effect of what was said in response could not easily be captured with pen and ink alone. Its subtleties, the slight facial gestures, the calculated tone, the languid rhythm, were elements that had to be imagined by the listener. To do so, one needed to understand the Roman temperament of the time. Reverence, once a cornerstone of Roman thought, had been steadily crumbling. Religion, once rooted in faith, had become little more than habit, a tradition clung to by the temple priests for profit and by poets who could not part with their ancient deities for the sake of verse. As philosophy took religion's place, satire had risen where reverence once stood. In Roman society, clever scorn had become a refined art, expected in every form of speech, as vital to conversation as salt to food or fragrance to wine. The young Messala, freshly returned from his education in Rome, had absorbed this fashion deeply. His manner conveyed indifference with practiced elegance, the faint twitch of an eyelid, the curl of a nostril, and a slow, measured voice, all delivered in a way that offered pauses just long enough to let his barbed remarks take hold. One such pause occurred right after he casually compared the truthfulness of Egyptians and Idumeans. The comment may have struck deeper than intended, for the Jewish youth said nothing in return. His cheeks flushed slightly, and his gaze remained fixed on the still waters of the pool, lost in thought or perhaps in memory. It was here, in this very garden, that the two friends had parted years before. Words of blessing were exchanged, one offering peace in the name of the Lord, the other invoking the protection of Roman gods. The moment, though brief, had stayed with them. Time had passed, 5 years to be exact, and now one had returned, full of polish and Roman pride, noting with admiration how his companion had grown into striking beauty, even likening him, with satirical flair, to a figure fit to serve as the emperor's cupbearer. Yet beneath the jest, there was an underlying question. Why Judah, the Jewish youth, seemed so concerned about the procurator's arrival? When Judah finally turned to him, his eyes were steady and full of quiet reflection. He recalled the farewell vividly, the ship that carried his friend away to Rome, the tears he shed, the love he felt. He acknowledged the change in Messala, the princely manner, the accomplishments. And yet, in that soft-spoken honesty, he confessed a subtle grief. He wished his friend had returned as the same Messala who once left. The Roman, ever the satirist, leaned further into his theatrical drawl. He mockingly praised Judah's solemn tone, suggesting he could become an oracle rather than a cupbearer, perhaps even take Delphi by storm if he mastered the art of mystery. And then, letting the playfulness fall away, he asked more seriously what had changed. He recalled a lesson from one of Rome's greatest rhetoricians, a teaching that still rang clear in his mind. One must understand their opponent before offering a reply. And so, with a rare hint of sincerity, he invited Judah to explain, to help him understand what had created the distance between them. The young man flushed under the cynical gaze directed at him. Still, his voice remained firm as he expressed the sting he felt from the change in his old friend. Once, Messala had been pure of heart, a friend who would never knowingly wound another. Now, however, his words bore the polished edge of Roman rhetoric and a hidden venom beneath. Messala, proud and patrician, only seemed amused, tossing his head higher in mock elegance. Judah tried to speak plainly, resisting the temptation to match sarcasm with sarcasm. In the years of their separation, he, too, had learned, not the worldly knowledge taught in Roman forums, but the spiritual wisdom of Hillel and the revered rabbis of Judea. Unlike Roman teachers who led their students into cleverness and moral ambiguity, the Jewish sages guided with reverence for God and law. That reverence had deepened Judah's love for his people and sharpened his pain at seeing them reduced to a mere province. He could not ignore the shame of seeing an unworthy priest in a role that rightfully belonged to another. Still, he acknowledged even the usurper as part of a sacred lineage that had served the God of Israel for generations. But Messala met these words with laughter, sharp and scornful. He mocked the unchanging nature of the Jewish people, likening their faith and customs to a circle drawn in sand, revolving endlessly around the same patriarchs and the same God, never expanding beyond their ancient ways. To him, this resistance to change was a limitation, a reason to ridicule. What of art? What of war? Of rhetoric? Of empire? In Rome, everything could be known and mastered. And for Messala, that was the path to greatness. Judah rose, his face burning with a quiet anger, but Messala motioned for him to sit. Then, almost cruelly, he mocked further. The Roman gods, he said, would soon interrupt and demand laughter instead of depth. Love, he claimed, was obsolete. War was Rome's god now. Marriage meant nothing, and virtue had become a commodity. Cleopatra, in her death, had cursed the world with seduction, and Roman households now bore her legacy. And then came the final blow, Messala's declaration of intent. He would become a soldier, and Judah, he pitied. What future could there be for a man bound by the traditions of a fading nation? As Judah moved closer to the quiet pool, Messala's tone took on an even deeper drawl, as if he were savoring every barb in his speech. With a mocking sort of sympathy, he pitted Judah for a life charted by tradition, from the school to the synagogue, onward to the temple, and, ultimately, the Sanhedrin. A life, he said, without adventure or opportunity. In contrast, Messala saw before himself the entire world waiting to be conquered. There were seas with undiscovered islands, northern lands untouched by Rome, and the unfinished dreams of Alexander still tempting the bold. He dreamed aloud of campaigns in Africa and Scythia, of commanding a legion, and of trading that glory for a position of power, a prefecture, where wealth, women, and pleasure flowed endlessly. Antioch, Judea, Syria, they were his for the taking. And in this glittering vision, he offered Judah a place, an invitation to share his fortune. To Judah, these words were dissonant and deeply unsettling. Raised in solemn tradition, where jest and satire held no sacred place, he struggled to grasp the tone. First confused, then offended, and finally stung. The disdain, the pride, the casual blasphemy, it all compounded into a sharp pain. And when Messala suggested making him high priest as a token of favor, it crossed a line. Judah turned away, anger rising. Messala, ever the performer, reached out with false warmth, trying to pull the moment back. He recalled their boyhood days, offered a walk with him, and draped an arm across his shoulder with forced affection. Judah allowed it, but his silence held distance. Then, with smug complacency, Messala began another lecture, this time about fate. He mocked Judah's faith, comparing it to the Roman belief in the three fates. The Parsi, who, scissors in hand, clipped destiny short. He claimed to believe in them too, half joking, half serious. And when Judah took offense at his talk of ruling Judea, Messala brushed it off. If someone must plunder the land, why not him? Judah's steps slowed. There had been many conquerors before Rome, he reminded, none of whom had endured. Judea had outlived them all, and would again. Messala, slipping back into his drawl, welcomed Judah sarcastically into the faith of the Parsi. But Judah rejected that path. His foundation was older, deeper, a covenant between his God and his people, one that went beyond Abraham. Still, Messala remained unshaken. Passion, he chided, was unbecoming of a Roman gentleman. Yet he softened his tone, hinting that he had more to say, though he hesitated. And then, with deliberate calm, he offered Judah another future, one outside the circle of tradition. Why not become a soldier? Why not step beyond the limits his faith had drawn around him? But Judah said nothing. Messala pressed on with his thoughts, his tone laced with scorn and conviction. He spoke of the so-called wise men of their time, dismissing those who wasted their lives arguing over ancient deities and forgotten philosophies, those lost in debates over Baals, Joves, and Jehovah's. To him, greatness belonged only to those who shaped their legacy through the present moment. He admired men who held nothing sacred unless it served their purpose, and who ignored nothing that could advance them. Herod, the Maccabees, the Caesars, they had all embraced that path. And now, standing near the garden gate, he urged Judah to do the same. He pointed to Rome, powerful, ever ready, just as she had once lifted up the Idumean Antipater. Judah, burning with rage, could no longer hold back his emotions. The nearness of the gate gave him the excuse to walk faster, desperate to break away from the conversation that pierced his soul. A quiet, anguished cry rose in his heart for his homeland, his voice low, heavy with sorrow. Messala, however, was relentless. With a cold clarity, he urged Judah to cast off the ways of Moses and the ancient traditions. To him, Rome was not just a city, it was the very embodiment of fate. Those who dare to look truth in the face, he claimed, would see it. Rome was the world. Judea, in that vision, existed only by Rome's will. At the threshold of the gate, Judah came to a halt. Gently, he removed Messala's hand from his shoulder and turned to face him. His eyes shimmered with restrained tears, his voice softened by pain. In that moment, he recognized the deep divide between them. Messala, shaped by Rome, could never understand the heart of an Israelite. The friendship they had once shared was gone, irreparably broken. And with that sorrowful understanding, he offered a farewell, one filled not with anger, but a quiet prayer for peace. Messala extended his hand one last time, but Judah walked on without taking it. Passing through the gate, he left the Roman in silence. After a moment, Messala moved forward too, tossing his head with defiance. Inwardly, he declared the end of affection, surrendering instead to conquest and power. From the entrance of the holy city, what would now be known as St. Stephen's Gate, a street stretched westward, running roughly parallel to the northern face of the old tower of Antonia. Though it lay a square away from that fortress, the street continued west as far as the Tyropean Valley, curving slightly southward along its path. Then, turning again, it resumed its westward course, reaching just beyond the traditional site of the Judgment Gate, where it veered suddenly to the south. Those familiar with Jerusalem's sacred geography would recognize this winding path as part of the Via Dolorosa, a street steeped in Christian reverence and sorrow. But the narrative did not require a full recounting of the route. Instead, attention was drawn to a particular house, standing at the angle where the road turned south, a structure notable enough to warrant closer observation. This building faced north and west, each side extending approximately 400 feet. Like many grand Easter dwellings, it rose 2 stories high and formed a perfect square. On the western side, the street measured about 12 feet across. On the northern, no more than 10. From below, the walls appeared rough and unfinished, yet solid and commanding. Large stone blocks, still bearing the marks of the quarry, formed the exterior, rugged and imposing. By modern eyes, the style might seem almost fortress-like, if not for the windows adorning the upper floor and the elaborate marble finish over the gates. There were 4 windows on the west side and 2 on the north, all placed in the second story and extended slightly outward over the narrow streets below. The only visible openings at ground level were the gates, reinforced with heavy iron bolts, giving the impression they were built to resist assault. Yet, the presence of marble cornices, bold and refined in design, signaled something more. Such architectural details hinted that the resident was not just wealthy, but also aligned with the Sadducees, both in political leaning and in faith. Sometime after the young Jewish man had left the Roman on the palace steps near the marketplace, he arrived at this very house. Approaching the western gate, he knocked. A small wicket, fitted into one side of the gate, was opened, and he stepped through quickly, ignoring the porter's humble greeting. The passageway he entered resembled a narrow tunnel, lined with paneled walls and a ceiling darkened by age. Stone benches flanked either side, smooth and darkened from generations of use. He climbed a short flight of steps, entering a long courtyard stretching north to south. 3 sides were enclosed by 2-story structures. On the lower levels were lewens, open, shaded spaces serving as shelters for animals or storage, while the upper levels held open terraces guarded by sturdy railings. The air here was filled with activity. Servants moved briskly across the terraces. Millstones ground rhythmically. Laundry swayed from lines strung overhead. Chickens and pigeons wandered freely. Goats, cows, donkeys, and horses were stabled in the lewens. A large stone trough, placed at the center, appeared to serve as a shared water source for all. This bustling space clearly served the domestic operations of the household. To the east, a wall marked another division, broken only by a passageway resembling the one he had first entered. Crossing through the second corridor, the young man stepped into another courtyard, this one more refined, square in shape, and adorned with shrubs and flowering vines. A marble basin stood near a shaded porch on the northern side, keeping the plants fresh and vibrant. The lewens here were loftier and more elegant, their entrances draped with curtains striped in red and white. Columns, clustered together, supported the arches above them. A staircase on the southern side led to the upper terraces, where wide awnings were stretched to block the sun. Another stairway ascended from the terraces to the rooftop, which was bordered by sculpted cornices and a parapet lined with six-sided tiles of bright red clay. Everywhere, there was a sense of careful order and immaculate cleanliness. Not even a single leaf was left to gather in the corners. Thus had no place here. This fastidious upkeep gave the courtyard an air of calm beauty. Any guest, even before meeting its inhabitants, would feel the presence of refinement, grace, and a home deeply cared for. As he stepped into the second courtyard, the young man veered to the right and followed a path through the blooming shrubbery. The scent of fresh flowers lingered in the warm air. He made his way toward the stairway and climbed to the terrace above, a wide stretch of white and brown paving stones, smoothed and worn from years of use. Passing under the shade of a stretched awning, he reached a doorway on the north side. Once inside, the screen dropped behind him, casting the room into shadow. Yet he moved forward with familiarity, crossing the tiled floor until he reached a divan. There, he collapsed face down, burying his forehead into his folded arms, letting the silence and stillness wrap around him like a cloak. As night approached, a woman quietly appeared at the door and called to him. Hearing her voice, he responded, and she entered the room. She gently asked if he was hungry, if he was unwell, and if he would see his mother, who waited in the summer house on the roof. He answered with weariness, neither ill nor well, only overcome by a sudden indifference. The day had begun with promise, yet something had shifted, draining the color from life. He told her to bring him whatever food she wished, anything that might ease his restlessness. The tenderness in her tone, the concern behind her quiet questions, reflected a bond forged over many years. She placed her hand upon his forehead, checking for fever, and then left, whispering that she would return soon. She came back with a wooden platter bearing a simple but thoughtful meal, a bowl of milk, broken pieces of white bread, finely mashed wheat, a roasted bird, honey and salt. A silver goblet of wine sat at one end, while a brass hand lamp at the other cast its warm glow through the room. The flickering light revealed the setting in full, walls plastered smooth, a ceiling marked by heavy oak beams stained by rain and time, and a floor of small blue and white tiles arranged in a diamond pattern. A few stools stood nearby, their legs carved in the shape of lions' paws. The divan, slightly raised above the floor, was draped in deep blue cloth and covered with a large, striped woolen blanket. It was a room of quiet dignity, a traditional Hebrew chamber, serene and intimate. The lamp also revealed the woman. She was about 50, her skin and eyes dark, her expression softened by a love that had grown beyond service, almost maternal. A white turban wrapped around her head, leaving her ears exposed, each pierced by a thick hole that marked her status. She was a slave of Egyptian origin, bound for life to the household. Freedom, even if offered, would have meant nothing to her, for the boy she served had become her reason for living. She had nursed him as an infant, cared for him through childhood, and now stood faithfully by him still. In her eyes, he would never be more than the child she had once rocked to sleep. During the quiet meal, he spoke only once, recalling Messala, the Roman who had once been a frequent guest in that very home. The memory brought visible disgust, and though she asked with concern to know more, he offered little beyond his disappointment. Messala had changed, he said, and he wanted no further connection. When the woman took the platter away, the young man quietly rose and left the room. From the terrace, he climbed upward to the rooftop, seeking perhaps the cool night air, or simply a moment alone. In the east, rooftops served many purposes, something well understood by those familiar with the region. As with all customs, climate dictated much. During the sweltering Syrian days, comfort was often sought within the shaded, enclosed lewins below. Yet when night descended, the atmosphere shifted. The cooling air, the deepening shadows over distant mountains, and the quiet hush of evening drew people upward. Though the mountains seemed cloaked in mystery, they were distant and unreachable. The rooftop, however, was close, lifted above the glowing plains just high enough to welcome the cooler breezes and to bring the stars nearer, shining brighter in the open sky. Thus, the rooftop became a cherished space, serving as a playground, a resting place, a gathering spot for family conversations, music, reflection, dance, and prayer. Where colder climates demanded elegant interiors, the Eastern mind turned its creativity skyward. The parapet, once mandated by Mosaic law, became a canvas for the potter's art. Above it, towers emerged, some simple, some ornate. In time, kings and nobles crowned their homes with summer pavilions built of marble and gold. The famed hanging gardens of Babylon, suspended in the air, were perhaps the most extravagant expression of this rooftop culture, one that could go no further in its ambition. That evening, the young man made his way slowly across the rooftop of his family's home. His destination was a tower built into the northwest corner of the palace. Had he been a guest, unfamiliar with its design, he might have paused to study the structure. A low, latticed space, supported by slender columns and crowned by a dome. Its outline, visible in the dim starlight, appeared both humble and elegant. He slipped beneath a partially raised curtain and entered. Inside, darkness wrapped the room, broken only by the night sky visible through 4 arched openings on each side. From these doorways, the stars cast a gentle glow. In one of the arches, reclining on a cushion pulled from a nearby divan, sat the faint silhouette of a woman. Her white robes shimmered softly in the low light, the fan in her hand catching starlight on the jeweled surface. At the soft sound of approaching footsteps, she stirred. The fan lowered, the silence paused, and she turned to him, recognizing his presence. Moved by the reunion, the young man crossed to her side and knelt. She welcomed him with open arms, embracing him with deep affection, holding him close in a gesture filled with love and comfort, as only a mother could. The mother reclined comfortably on the cushion as her son rested his head in her lap. From their position, they could gaze out over the nearby rooftops, catch a glimpse of the darkened mountain line in the west, and see a sky filled with quiet, glittering stars. The city below remained hushed. Only the soft stirrings of the wind broke the stillness. She gently stroked his face, trying to reassure him, speaking in the nearly forgotten language cherished by the few who still clung to its purity, a tongue once sung by beloved ancestors like Rebecca and Rachel. Her words stirred something deep within him. He grasped her hand and shared how the day had filled his mind with unfamiliar thoughts, uncertainties about his purpose and identity. With great tenderness, he asked her what he was meant to become, and although she lovingly insisted he would always be her hero, he yearned for something more grounded. He understood her love and guidance had shaped his life so far, but the time was approaching when he would have to stand alone to find his own path, and he needed her help to decide whether to be a herdsman, a farmer, a craftsman, a scholar, or something more. In an effort to understand the source of his unrest, she guessed at possible influences. Perhaps Gamaliel had lectured that day, or maybe he'd walked with Simeon, but he clarified that he'd been at the marketplace, visiting the young Messala. The mention of that name caused her heart to quicken. The tone of her son's voice had changed, subtle, yet unmistakable. She feared what Messala might have said to trouble him. Judah explained that Messala had changed. He had returned with the demeanor of a Roman. And though Messala had always carried a certain arrogance, he once spared Judea from his ridicule. Now, however, for the first time, he had mocked not only their customs, but their God. This deeply wounded Judah. He parted ways with his old friend, but the encounter left him restless, questioning his worth. Why should he, a son of Israel, feel inferior? Why must he shy away before Roman pride? Was he not equally capable of greatness, whether in war, in art, in poetry, or in trade? Why should he be denied the freedom to aspire? The mother, quick to understand, sat upright, her voice sharp with realization. She recognized that Messala, once shaped by their world, had become something else. His years in Rome had changed him beyond return. She mourned the loss of the boy who might have once embraced their faith, and she grieved that he could now so easily forget the bond they once shared. Her hand rested lovingly on Judah's brow as her thoughts reached toward the stars. His pride was her pride, and she could not let him feel defeated. Yet, as a mother, she feared she lacked the strength to answer such weighty questions. She hesitated, suggesting they speak with the wise Simeon. But Judah declined. He needed not just knowledge, but the inner strength only she could inspire. He wanted her to help shape his resolve. She reflected deeply. In seeking fairness for themselves, it would be unwise to unjustly diminish others. To claim superiority over the Romans purely based on their current strength, or lack thereof, would be shallow. She began to speak again, gathering her thoughts carefully. Messala, she explained, came from a noble lineage, generations of soldiers, senators, and statesmen. But if nobility were to be measured by heritage alone, Judah's ancestry could match his friends, point for point. He had nothing to fear in comparison, not in blood, rank, or virtue. She continued, thoughtfully. Romans often pointed to the passage of time as a sign of greatness. But their history began with the founding of Rome, and few could trace their lineage before that. Most relied on myth or vague traditions. Judah, however, had something far more solid. With rising pride, she reminded him of the day he was presented in the temple, his name recorded, Judah, son of Ithamar, of the house of Hur. Their family's name had been etched in the sacred book, part of a tradition going back to Abraham himself. The Israelites had preserved these records since before their flight from Egypt, and even through the exile, they had restored them with care and faith. Thanks to Zerubbabel, the line from her to Judah could still be traced back more than 2,000 years. She paused, allowing that truth to settle. Compared to the noble claims of Roman houses, the shepherds of Israel, those keeping flocks on the plains of Rephaim, were of a nobler stock than the greatest Roman families. And Judah, descended directly from her, could claim an unbroken line of honor reaching back through the ages. Judah listened in silence, then held her hands in gratitude. She had said all he needed to hear, more convincingly than any scholar could. Yet, he wondered, was time alone enough to make a family truly noble? His mother reminded him that their true strength came not only from time, but from divine favor. The Lord's covenant set them apart. But Judah pressed further. He wasn't speaking of the entire race, but of their own family. What had they done to lift themselves above others? What achievements marked their place in history? She paused, realizing that perhaps this wasn't just about pride or injury. Perhaps this was his soul, awakening, reaching for its destiny, seeking not validation, but a vision of purpose. To the young, such questions are sacred. The answers can shape lifetimes. A wrong word could misguide a soul in the making. Softly, she touched his cheek and spoke again. She had sensed there was more at play than Messala's words. There was something deeper, something stirring within her son. But to offer a true answer, she needed to understand everything. She urged him to tell her all that Messala had said. The young Israelite began to recount his conversation with Messala, describing in detail how his childhood friend had mocked the customs and traditions of their people. As Judah spoke, the mother listened in silence, though every word struck her deeply. She could clearly see what had happened. Her son had gone to visit the marketplace palace out of affection for the boyhood friend he remembered so fondly. But instead of finding that friend unchanged, Judah encountered a man transformed, no longer rooted in the past, but obsessed with future conquests, power, and glory. Though Judah may not have realized it, the visit had wounded his pride and awakened within him a fierce ambition. The mother, however, saw it all clearly. Her heart, filled with fear, began to imagine the worst, that her son might drift from the faith of his fathers. To her, that was the most terrifying possibility of all. And so, with love sharpening her voice and wisdom guiding her, she resolved to speak, not with the gentleness of a mother only, but with the strength of a poet and the fire of a prophet. She began by explaining that every nation sees itself as superior, and great powers often view others with scorn. Rome's disdain for Israel was nothing new. It simply echoed the ancient arrogance of Egypt, Assyria, and Macedonia. And just like those former empires, Rome's pride would meet the same end, because it stood against God himself. She reflected on history, explaining that no rule of law could define the superiority of a nation, for nations rise and fall, their names rewritten by those who follow. Humanity's path, unlike God's straight line, always moved in cycles, never identical, but always returning. Her tone deepened as she drew a comparison between the Hebrew and the Roman, focusing not on war or territory, but on the moral and spiritual height of their civilizations. Where the Romans never truly knew God, the Hebrews had at times forgotten him, but had always been called back. She addressed Messala's mocking claim that the Jews had no poets or warriors, pointing out that true greatness came not from fame or conquest, but from being chosen by God for a divine purpose. Even Gentile rulers like the Persians and the Macedonian were honored, not for their own power, but because they were instruments in God's plan. That divine calling, she reminded him, defined greatness, not earthly power. She then spoke of how the world often glorified war and strength, while fearing what it could not understand. This fear turned into worship, heroes elevated to gods. But while Rome worshipped Jove, a glorified warrior, the Greeks had risen higher by honoring the mind. In Athens, intellect had been celebrated above brute force, and their thinkers were revered more than their soldiers. Even Rome, for all its pride, imitated Greek excellence in speech, poetry, and philosophy, borrowing their forms and teachings while claiming originality only in war. Yet, among all peoples, only Israel could rival the Greeks in original genius. For while the Greeks gave the world philosophy, the Hebrews gave it God. Her voice turned sorrowful. Rome had conquered much, including the sacred lands of Judea. They now held the holiest places, and the outcome of this domination was uncertain. Still, her belief was unwavering. The glory of Israel would never be erased. Their history was God's own testimony, written through their hands, spoken through their mouths. God had walked among them, as lawgiver on Sinai, as shepherd in the wilderness, as judge, king, and guide. He had shown them truth, given them promises sealed with everlasting covenants. She asked, could such nearness to the divine have left no mark? Could a people touched by God bear no hint of his glory? For a while, silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle movement of her fan. Then, as if returning to earth from some higher thought, she softly admitted that, in the narrow sense, limited to sculpture and painting, Israel might not have produced artists. With a note of regret, the mother acknowledged the truth. As a Sadducee, her beliefs allowed her to cherish beauty in all its forms. Unlike the Pharisees, whose rigid interpretation left little space for artistic appreciation. Still, she gently reminded that any lack of artistic legacy in Israel was not due to inability, but obedience. The hands of their ancestors have been bound by a sacred commandment, not to make graven images or likenesses of anything. Later generations had misapplied and extended this commandment beyond its original intent. Yet long before Daedalus had stepped into Attica, reshaping sculpture and laying the foundation for Corinth and Aegina's artistic schools. And long before such works graced the Poesil or the Capitoline, two Israelites, Bezaleel and Aholiab, had crafted wonders for the first tabernacle. They formed cherubim of beaten gold, not chiseled stone, statues shaped both human and divine, wings stretched heavenward, faces turned toward one another. In form and splendor, these creations stood as the earliest known sculptures. And though their memory had faded from history's artistic canon, who could deny their beauty? This understanding struck Judah deeply. His soul burned with indignation at the thought of the ark's destruction, cursing the Babylonians in his heart. But his mother gently corrected him, reminding that the ark had not been destroyed, only hidden. According to the teachings of Hillel and Shammai, it remained buried in the mountains, waiting. In the Lord's chosen time, it would be found again. When that day came, Israel would rejoice with dance and song. And those who beheld the cherubim once more, even those familiar with ivory statues of Minerva, would find themselves drawn in awe, perhaps even moved to kiss the hand of a Jew in tribute to a genius long dormant. In her rising excitement, her voice took on the intensity of a public speaker. To steady herself, she paused, gathering her thoughts. Her son, filled with gratitude, praised her wisdom. Yet she humbly confessed that much of what she shared were words once spoken by Hillel during a debate with a Roman sophist. Still, the passion behind them was her own. Returning to her central thought, she emphasized that artistry was not just technique, it was spirit. Sculpture alone did not define greatness. She imagined the great men of history parading through time in noble companies, each bearing their national identities. The Indian, the Egyptian, the Assyrian, each passing beneath banners and trumpet calls, cheered by generations past and future. The Greeks might boast, claiming the lead in philosophy and beauty. Rome, in turn, might silence them with declarations of power. But above them all, unseen by those caught in earthly rivalries, a divine light streamed across ages, the light of revelation. This light did not belong to empires. It belonged to the people chosen to carry it, Israel. It was by that light the world had come to know truth. Her voice trembled with reverence, praising the old Judean blood. In her eyes, their fathers, servants of God and keepers of his covenant, stood as true leaders of both the living and the dead. No empire, no matter how powerful, could claim the front of that procession. Judah was moved beyond words. Her passion stirred something ancient within him, a memory of tambourines, of Miriam's dance, of a people rejoicing in freedom. Sensing his emotion, she invited him to imagine standing at the roadside as Israel's chosen passed before them. She described the scene with poetic detail, the patriarchs leading, followed by tribal leaders. The jingling of camel bells and the lowing of herds filled the air. One figure walked alone among them, an aged man whose eyes still burned bright, whose strength had not faded. He had spoken face to face with the Almighty. Warrior, poet, orator, prophet, and lawgiver, his greatness cast shadows even upon the mightiest rulers of Rome. Then came the judges, and after them the kings. There was the son of Jesse, bold in war and timeless in song, and his son, wise beyond all others, building cities in the wilderness, yet never forgetting Jerusalem, God's chosen seed on earth. She urged her son to bow his head, for what followed were the prophets, each one raised above time, their eyes lifted as if listening to a divine voice. Their lives were steeped in suffering. Their garments carried the scent of caves and tombs. Yet through their voices, God had spoken. They foresaw the future and recorded it faithfully. Kings trembled before them. Nations fell at their words. The elements obeyed their call. Their presence brought either mercy or destruction. The mother named them with reverence. The fierce Tishbite, his devoted servant Elisha, the mournful son of Hilkiah, the visionary by the river Chebar. She remembered the faithful who defied Babylon's golden image, and among them stood one whose wisdom silenced astrologers in a hall filled with lords. Then, with trembling voice, she mentioned the gentle son of Amoz, the one who gave the world its clearest promise of the Messiah to come. Her fan, which had moved restlessly during her speech, now stilled. Her voice dropped low. Sensing her weariness, Judah expressed concern, but she gently dismissed it, more focused on her message than comfort. She reminded him of the great men she had described, their deeds, their faith. Turning then to Rome's heroes, she placed them side by side with Israel's. Moses against Caesar, Tarquin against David, Sulla against the Maccabees, Augustus against Solomon. Each Roman figure, even in greatness, fell short, and when it came to the prophets, the greatest of all, Rome had no answer. She laughed bitterly at the thought of a Roman soothsayer warning Caesar about the Ides of March by reading a chicken's entrails. In contrast, she recalled Elijah, calmly seated on a hill, pronouncing divine wrath upon kings. Finally, she posed a bold thought. If one must judge the gods by the deeds of their servants, then what comparison could be drawn between Jehovah and Jupiter? Her voice grew soft, trembling with emotion, as she addressed her son one last time. Whatever path he chose, he must serve the Lord of Israel, not the power of Rome. For a child of Abraham, glory could only be found in walking God's path. And within that path, there was glory indeed. Judah asked if that meant he could be a soldier. Her answer came with gentle strength. Yes, if he served the Lord and not Caesar. Silence fell between them in the warm summer air. She eventually gave him her blessing, so long as his loyalty remained with God. At peace, Judah drifted into sleep. His mother tenderly placed a cushion beneath his head, wrapped him with a shawl, kissed him gently, and left him to rest. Just as the righteous, like the wicked, must meet the end of life, those who hold to the faith take comfort in believing that death is not a closing, but an awakening to the light of heaven. It is like rising from a peaceful sleep, surrounded by joy, light, and song. So it was with Judah that morning. He awoke to the sun climbing above the mountains, the air filled with the gentle flutter of white-winged pigeons gliding in flocks. In the distance, the temple shimmered, a vision of gold against the soft blue sky. But these were all familiar to him, hardly stirring his attention. What truly caught his eye was the girl sitting at the edge of the divan near him. She appeared to be no older than 15, and she played a nebel gracefully on her knee, singing softly as her fingers touched the strings. He listened, and this was her song. Wake not, but hear me, love, adrift upon slumber's sea. Let your spirit rise and listen to me. I bring you dreams, sweet and kind, a gift from sleep, the restful king. So choose the happiest, the most divine, and sleep again, unless you dream of me. As the final note faded, she set the instrument gently aside and rested her hands in her lap, quietly waiting for him to respond. To know more of her and the family to which she belonged, one must look back to a time when Herod's favor had left certain men with both wealth and influence. If a man was of notable lineage, especially from the tribe of Judah, and bore great fortune, he was honored as a prince of Jerusalem. Such status brought respect from Jews and Gentiles alike. Judah's father had been one such man. Proud of his heritage, yet loyal to the king, he served Herod both at home and in foreign lands. His service in Rome drew the admiration of Augustus himself, who gifted him with rare treasures, purple robes, ivory seats, golden vessels, all marks of imperial favor. But the man's wealth did not rest on royal generosity alone. He embraced the laws that encouraged honest enterprise. His business stretched across the land, from herdsmen under the shadows of Lebanon to merchant houses in coastal cities. His ships brought silver from Spanish mines, and caravans from the east delivered silks and spices. Though deeply faithful to Hebrew law, a regular presence in synagogue and temple, and a devout student of the scriptures, he did not separate himself from others. He honored Hillel and welcomed travelers of all kinds, even Samaritans, to the disapproval of rigid Pharisees. Had he been born Gentile, his fame might have rivaled that of Herod's Atticus. But fate claimed him at sea, in the prime of his life, 10 years before this chapter of our story began. He was mourned across Judea. Of his family, we have already met the widow and the son. The girl singing beside Judah that morning was the only other, his young sister. Tirzah was her name. As the siblings exchanged glances, the similarity in their appearance was unmistakable. Her features shared the same structured elegance as his, quintessentially Jewish in their contour. Yet, what made her stand out even more was the childlike innocence that softly lit her expression. She sat comfortably in the ease of home, clothed casually, as trust and love permitted. A loosely draped chemise, fastened at her right shoulder, flowed gently over her torso and under her left arm, bearing her arms entirely. A girdle cinched the fabric at the waist, marking the beginning of her skirt. Her hair was modestly adorned, a silky, Tyrian-dyed cap beneath a striped, embroidered scarf, wound in delicate folds that hugged the natural shape of her head. A tassel crowned the cap's top, falling gently. Gold rings glistened at her ears and fingers, with matching anklets and bracelets. Around her neck lay a collar of gold, decorated with a lattice of fine chains and pendants of pearl. Her eyelids bore a touch of paint, and her fingertips were stained. Her long hair hung in two neat plaits down her back, with curled locks resting softly on her cheeks. Grace, refinement, and beauty enveloped her entire presence. The brother admired her openly, touched by her charm and song. She shared how she had learned it, from a Greek singer once favored by Herod's court. Though the original had been in Greek, she had rendered it into Hebrew. Judah praised both her voice and the melody's cleverness, admitting his pride in her. Yet, their tender moments soon shifted. She revealed an amulet, a supposed ancient Persian charm, once worn by their grandmother and approved by rabbis. Judah, however, dismissed it as idolatrous, a relic unfit for the faithful. Though initially surprised, Tirzah finally accepted his view, only to be reassured that it still added to her beauty. Their conversation was briefly interrupted by Imrah, who arrived with water, towels, and breakfast. Judah's ritual ablution was brief, not being a Pharisee. Imrah left, and Tirzah remained to comb his hair, checking her progress with a tiny mirror from her girdle, letting him admire the results. Their exchange remained warm and playful until Judah suddenly revealed a serious intent. He was planning to leave. Tirzah was stunned. Her voice shook with questions: when, where, and why. Judah explained that the law demanded he follow a trade, and idleness was not an option. He had chosen to go to Rome. She begged to accompany him, but he reminded her that their mother needed her. Disappointment clouded her face. She urged him to stay, arguing that knowledge and opportunity existed in Jerusalem. But Judah had other aspirations, not to be a merchant, like their father, but a soldier. Fear filled Tirzah's heart. She clung to him, terrified he'd be killed. He reassured her gently. All soldiers were not destined to die. Her sorrow deepened, insisting he remain, as their home was full of happiness. He countered with bittersweet honesty. Home would change, and even she would one day leave with a husband. Her sobs were answer enough. Judah continued, more solemn now. To become a soldier, he would need to learn the craft properly, and there was no better place than a Roman camp. Tirzah gasped at the idea of him fighting for Rome, the empire hated by all, even herself. Yet, in that hatred he saw purpose. He would learn from Rome, not to serve her, but to one day rise against her. As she asked when he would leave, footsteps neared once again. Umrah was returning. Judah, lowering his voice, told Tirzah not to reveal anything just yet. The faithful servant entered with breakfast and set the tray on a stool before them. Draped in white napkins on her arm, she remained nearby, ready to serve. As they dipped their fingers into a bowl of water and began to rinse them, a sudden noise caught their attention. They paused and listened. It was the sound of martial music coming from the street on the north side of the house. Excited, the young man leapt from the divan and hurried outside, exclaiming that he must see the soldiers from the praetorium. In no time, he was leaning over the tiled parapet that bordered the roof's far northeast corner. So absorbed was he in the scene unfolding below, he didn't notice Tirzah standing beside him, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. From their vantage point, the highest rooftop in the neighborhood, they had a clear view of the surrounding houses stretching eastward, all the way to the towering, irregular structure of the Antonia fortress. This citadel served as the garrison and military headquarters for the Roman governor. The narrow street below, scarcely 10 feet wide, was spanned in places by bridges, some open, others covered, and like the rooftops lining the way, they were beginning to fill with people drawn out by the blaring of instruments. Though described as music, it was more of an uproar, trumpets and the shrill blast of Litue, beloved by Roman soldiers. Eventually, the procession came into view from their rooftop perch. Leading the way was a vanguard of lightly armed troops, mainly slingers and archers, marching in wide intervals. They were followed by a unit of heavy infantry, their large shields and long spears reminiscent of those once used in the battles before Ilium. Then came the musicians, followed by a solitary officer riding alone, with a close guard of cavalry trailing behind him. Another column of heavy infantry brought up the rear, marching in tight formation that filled the street from wall to wall, giving the impression of an endless flow. Judah was struck not just by what he saw, but by what he felt. The strong limbs of the soldiers, the rhythmic sway of their shields, the gleam of polished scales, buckles, breastplates, and helms, the proud nodding of tall plumes, the flicker of ensigns and spears capped with iron, the confident, perfectly timed step, and the overall unity of the force. Every element worked in mechanical harmony. Yet amidst it all, two sights held Judah's attention above the rest. The first was the legion's eagle, a gilded emblem mounted on a tall shaft, its wings extended upward until they met. He recognized it immediately, knowing that when it was brought out from its chamber in the tower, it was revered with almost divine honors. The second point of fascination was the officer riding alone. Though his head was bare, he wore full armor. A short sword hung at his left hip, but in his hand he carried a truncheon that looked more like a rolled scroll of white paper. Instead of a saddle, he sat on a rich purple cloth. The horse was adorned with a bridle trimmed in gold, and reins of yellow silk fringed with broad tassels along the edges. Even from a distance, Judah noticed how the officer's presence stirred anger among the onlookers. People leaned from parapets and stepped boldly forward to shake their fists. They shouted, spat down from bridges, and even hurled sandals, many with remarkable aim. The women, too, joined in, their cries rising above the din. As he drew nearer, their shouts became clear. "Robber, tyrant, dog of a Roman, away with Ishmael, give us back our Hannes." Judah could also see that the officer did not return the soldier's indifference. His expression was dark and sullen, and the glances he cast at the crowd were full of menace, enough to make even the boldest draw back in fear. Judah remembered the custom, borrowed from Julius Caesar himself, where commanding officers appeared in public wearing only a laurel vine upon their heads, a mark of their authority. It was by that very sign he recognized the man, Valerius Gratus, the new procurator of Judea. To tell the truth, the young Jew actually felt a wave of sympathy for the Roman as he suffered the unprovoked attack. So when the man reached the corner of the house, the boy leaned even farther over the parapet to watch him pass. As he did, he rested his hand on a tile that had been cracked for a long time, ignored and unrepaired. The pressure from his hand was just enough to dislodge the outer piece. It began to fall. A shock of horror surged through the boy. He reached out, trying to catch it, but the motion, to anyone watching, looked exactly like he was throwing something. Worse still, the effort only propelled the tile further out over the wall. He shouted as loud as he could. The guards looked up, and so did the important man, just in time to be struck by the falling piece. He collapsed from his seat, seemingly dead. The cohort halted at once. Guards jumped from their horses, rushing to protect the fallen man with their shields. Meanwhile, the watching crowd, convinced that the blow was intentional, cheered the boy, who now stood frozen in full view, horrified by what he had done and by the consequences that flashed clearly before him. A wild and dangerous energy spread like fire across the rooftops along the procession's route. It seized the people, driving them into the same reckless fury. Hands tore at the parapets, ripping up tiles and chunks of sun-dried mud that formed much of the roofs. With no real aim, they hurled everything down at the soldiers below. A battle followed. Predictably, discipline overcame chaos. The details of the fight, the bloodshed, the bravery, the panic, don't belong in this story. What matters more is the boy who unintentionally caused it all. He backed away from the parapet, his face ghostly pale. He cried out to his sister, wondering aloud what would become of them. She hadn't seen what had happened, though the shouting and wild motion of the people on the rooftops told her something terrible was unfolding. But she didn't know what exactly, or that she or her loved ones might be in danger. When he told her the Roman governor had been struck by a tile that fell from their house, her face turned as white as ashes. She didn't speak, only wrapped an arm around him and looked into his eyes, silently absorbing his fear and pain. That moment gave him strength. He insisted he didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. She asked what happened now. He looked down at the chaos in the street and on the rooftops. The image of Governor Gratus's grim face filled his thoughts. If the man survived, what limits would his anger have? If he died, how far would the soldiers go in retaliation? To avoid answering, he peered again over the edge just as the guards helped the Roman back onto his horse. He cried out that the man was alive, praising the God of their fathers. With relief brightening his face, he turned to reassure his sister. He told her not to be afraid. He'd explain everything. Surely their father's memory and loyal service would protect them. He began to lead her toward the summer house, but the roof suddenly trembled underfoot. A loud crash of timber bursting apart followed. Then came shouts of pain and confusion. Voices shouting in rage, and others praying in fear. Then the unmistakable screams of women in terror. The soldiers had broken through the north gate and entered the house. A terrible sense of being hunted overcame him. His first instinct was to run, but where could he go? Only wings could save him now. Tirza, terrified, clung to his arm and demanded to know what was happening. In his mind, he heard the cries of dying servants, and his mother's voice, unmistakably hers. He tried to stay calm and told Tirza to wait for him while he went to see what was going on and then come back. But his voice betrayed him. It trembled. Tirza held on to him even tighter. Then came his mother's voice again, sharper, clearer, too real to dismiss. That was the final push. Without hesitation, he told her to come. They would go down together. At the foot of the great stone steps, the terrace lay flooded with the presence of Roman soldiers. It was a scene of tension and chaos. Some stood as sentinels while others moved hurriedly in and out of the inner chambers, their swords drawn and eyes sharp. On one side, a group of women knelt helplessly. Some clung to one another in silent terror. Others raised trembling hands in prayer, seeking mercy from hearts grown cold. Amidst them, a lone figure stood apart, her garments torn, her long hair veiling a face twisted with anguish. She struggled against a soldier's grip, her desperate cries rising above the din, slicing through the air like sharpened steel. And as those cries pierced the stone and dust, a young man, swift as wind, sprang toward her. His heart cried out in recognition. But just before reaching her outstretched hands, he was seized, dragged away, powerless. Then came the cold accusation. He had been identified. And in that cruel moment, Judah's eyes found Messala, no longer a friend, but the betrayer. Words were exchanged, indifferent and mocking. And in the cruelty of it all, the young Judah, once full of hope and dreams, found himself pleading, not for his life, but for his mother, his sister. Yet no compassion answered him. Instead, Messala turned away, more entertained by the chaos in the streets than the fate of those he once called family. Even the officer, momentarily stirred by Judah's desperate appeals, offered only partial mercy. The women were to be taken to the tower, unharmed but imprisoned. As the soldiers bound Judah's hands and led him away, his gaze followed his mother, carried like a burden, and Tirzah, frozen in fear, walking silently beside her captors. With a final look, he pressed his face into his hands, trying to sear the memory into his soul. Something inside him changed at that moment, quietly but entirely. Until now, his nature had been gentle, shaped by love and the warmth of belonging. He had known dreams, yes, but they were soft ones, like a child watching ships drift along a quiet sea. But now all that had crumbled, like a cherished idol torn from its altar and thrown into dust. The world he knew was gone. When he finally lifted his head, the innocence that once curved his lips had vanished. In that instant, Judah ceased to be a boy. He had become a man. Soon after, a trumpet shattered the silence. The soldiers cleared out, leaving behind treasures too dangerous to keep. As Judah was brought down the steps, he saw the full machinery of Roman vengeance in motion. His family, his home, everything was being stripped away. The north gate was barely passable through its ruins. One by one, servants, animals, and possessions were let out. Some wept as if torn from the only life they had ever known. Judah now understood. This wasn't just punishment, it was a warning. The destruction was deliberate. No living soul would remain within those walls. The fall of the house of Hur would become a tale to frighten anyone daring to dream of resistance. Outside, the officer waited as men sealed the gates. The streets were quieting. Clouds of dust lingered where brief struggles still smoldered. Judah no longer felt fear for himself. His heart belonged to those taken from him. But he searched among the prisoners in vain. Then, like a whisper of hope, a figure rose from the earth. Umrah, covered in dust, hair tangled and wild. She ran past the soldiers and clung to him. Her voice failed her, but her presence spoke enough. Judah, helpless once more, urged her to live, for his mother, for Tirzah. As a soldier pulled her away, she tore free and vanished into the courtyard. The officer's order was cruel and final. The house would be sealed, and she, left behind, would starve. With grim determination, the soldiers finished their work, locking the gates from all sides. And thus, the great house of the Hurs passed into silence. The cohort then marched back to the tower, carrying with them the prisoners and the memory of one family's fall. 10 days would pass before the procurator, wounded but recovered, reappeared in the marketplace. His judgment complete, his warning delivered. The very next day, Roman legionaries arrived at the once proud but now abandoned palace. They closed its great gates for good, sealed its corners with wax, and hammered a stark notice in Latin onto the sides of the entryway. It read, in the cold certainty of imperial law, that the place now belonged to the emperor. That single declaration, without guard or ceremony, was deemed enough, typical of Roman authority, where a few words could claim the world. And it worked. By the noon of the following day, another detachment approached the sleepy hillside village of Nazareth from the south, riding out from Jerusalem. At that time, Nazareth was hardly more than a scattered hamlet, a lone ribbon of a path rather than a proper street, shaped by the routine footsteps of livestock and shepherds. The plains of Ephelon brushed its southern edge, and from the western ridge, one could gaze far to the shimmering coastline of the Mediterranean, to the lands beyond the Jordan, and even to snow-capped Hermon. The surrounding valleys bloomed with orchards, gardens, vineyards, and grazing fields. Palm groves lent the land a distinct eastern charm. The homes, modest and unevenly placed, were single-storied, flat-roofed dwellings, their walls embraced by trailing green vines. The harsh drought that had left Judea scorched and barren seemed to halt at Galilee's border, sparing Nazareth's gentle beauty. But the sudden blast of a trumpet as the riders drew near shattered that peaceful stillness. Doors flung open, and neighbors poured into the street, startled by the rare appearance of Roman cavalry. Their anxiety deepened upon recalling that their village was far from the main roads and under the influence of Judas of Gamala, a rebel name feared even by the empire. Yet as the legionaries paraded through the narrow street, their purpose became clear, and the villagers' fear gave way to restless curiosity. They followed the mounted unit toward the northeast corner of the town, toward the well. There, among the soldiers, was a lone prisoner, a young man, weary and bound. He walked barefoot, dust-covered, and shirtless, his hands tied behind him. A leather strap ran from his wrists to a horse's neck, forcing him to keep pace or be dragged. Dust swirled around him with every step, veiling him in a suffocating yellow haze. He was slouched and stumbling, too tired to resist, too dazed to speak. And when the cavalcade paused at the well and the soldiers dismounted, he collapsed to the ground without protest. The villagers, gathering nearby, saw clearly then he was barely more than a boy. Their hearts stirred with pity, and though fear kept them from acting, the will to help flickered within them. As confusion lingered among the villagers, with water being passed from hand to hand among the Roman soldiers, their attention turned toward a solitary figure descending the road from Sepphoris. His appearance drew immediate recognition. A woman's voice rose above the murmurs, her tone part hopeful, part curious, as she pointed him out. It was the old carpenter, a man known for his quiet wisdom. With his weathered gray robe and a full turban beneath which thin white hair spilled out, he carried the look of a man seasoned by time. His long, snow-white beard rested against his chest, and his steps were slow, burdened not only by age but by the weight of his tools, an axe, a saw, and a heavy drawing knife, all crude and worn from use. He had clearly traveled far without rest. The carpenter paused near the gathering, surveying the scene with calm eyes. A woman quickly approached him, imploring him to ask the soldiers about the chained youth, who he was, what crime he had committed, and what fate awaited him. The carpenter, known as Rabbi Joseph, remained composed but stepped forward to speak with the Roman officer. With a respectful tone, he greeted him, then began inquiring about the prisoner. The officer responded plainly. The young man was accused of attempted assassination. Shock rippled through the crowd. The rabbi pressed further, learning that the prisoner was a Jew, and more notably, the son of the once-honored Prince Ben-Hur of Jerusalem. Murmurs spread like wildfire among the villagers. The officer recounted how, only days earlier in Jerusalem, the youth had nearly struck down the noble Gratus with a falling tile. Though the victim had survived, the punishment was severe. Judah Ben-Hur was sentenced to the Roman galleys for life. At this, the usually unshaken rabbi uttered a heartfelt prayer under his breath. Among the people who had accompanied the rabbi was a young apprentice, unnoticed until now. Quietly, the boy set down the axe he had been carrying and stepped toward the nearby stone by the well. He lifted a pitcher of water, and before anyone could object, he moved beside the prisoner and gently offered him a drink. His touch upon the youth's shoulder stirred the chained Judah from his daze. Lifting his eyes, Judah beheld the face of the boy, a boy not much older than himself, with soft locks of chestnut-colored hair and deep blue eyes that radiated kindness, compassion, and a mysterious inner strength. In those eyes was a calm, commanding love that disarmed all resistance. In that moment, years of pain and the fury of betrayal seemed to lift from Judah's soul. Without a word, he drank deeply, the water quenching not just his thirst but something broken inside him. When he had finished, the boy laid his hand gently upon Judah's dust-covered hair, long enough for what felt like a silent blessing, and then returned the pitcher to its place. Lifting the axe once more, he rejoined Rabbi Joseph. Every eye followed him, even the Roman officers' gaze lingering with quiet reverence. Thus ended the scene at the village well. After the horses and soldiers were refreshed, the procession prepared to move again. But something had changed. The officer, whose demeanor had been stern, now approached Judah with unexpected gentleness. He lifted the prisoner himself, helping him onto a horse behind one of the guards. The villagers returned silently to their homes, Rabbi Joseph and his young apprentice among them. And so it was, on that dusty path, under a quiet sky, that Judah Ben-Hur first encountered the son of Mary, and just as quietly, they parted ways. Thus, in the hush of that sacred hour, something unseen had stirred. A moment passed between two souls, one broken by cruelty, the other shining with a peace beyond reason. No words were exchanged, yet something deeper was spoken. In the boy's eyes, Judah glimpsed not just kindness, but a promise, something eternal, as if time itself had paused to whisper, "Watch closely, for nothing will ever be the same again." And now, we are left wondering, was this chance or destiny? Who is this boy from Nazareth whose silence speaks louder than any voice? For Judah Ben-Hur, enslaved and forgotten, is this his end, or the very beginning of a journey that will awaken kingdoms and test the soul of man? The wheel of fate has begun to turn, and in the shadows of pain, a light, gentle yet unstoppable, has begun to rise. Stay with us. In the next episode, the road will lead to chains, sea, and destiny. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next part of this incredible journey.